Hello, hello, hello. Right now, just a solo show. Maybe Mike will be joining shortly, but yeah, just here to recap day one of the Senior Bowl practices. Um, we saw a lot of good performances maybe and some maybe less good performances, and so just gonna hit a quick stock up and stock down for all of y'all, and then if you guys have any questions or any players you want some opinions about, happy to answer those. Make sure to drop those in the chat, and yeah, apologize for the lighting, but I think it helps hide my sunburn even just a little bit, and so apologies for that, but yeah, anyway, let's get started. So on the national team, we had a fairly big group of defensive backs, corners, and safeties. So if I had to give one stock up, I think the obvious answer to this was obviously Quinyon Mitchell. His tape is probably first round tape anyway, but he was really uh, putting some good reps out there today. He looked physical. Mike noticed earlier that Quinyon Mitchell is was playing mostly on the left side of the ball, which is an interesting note. Obviously, uh, corners at the next level don't limit themselves to one side of the ball, but yeah, I think Quinyon Mitchell was a clear moneymaker today uh, for Senior Bowl practices day one on the national team. I think maybe one another. Actually, I'll go with another stock up. Stock up was also Max Melton. He brother of Bo Melton, the both from Rutgers. I think when it's all said and done, I think that Max Melton showed that he's fast enough. He had one of the fastest time speeds for the Zebra Technologies, which tracks all the players here at the Senior Bowl. And he was playing a lot of the slot. He played on the outside. I think that generally speaking, he's someone that will show flexibility and versatility while also being um, somewhat desirable to defensive coordinators and just in basic coverage, even beyond specific roles. And so I fully expect him to get drafted, obviously, but I think that he'll get drafted, maybe even a top 100 pick. And so I'd say great day for Max Melton as well. Maybe less great days. We did have a couple, roster updates that happened somewhat recently, where people like Jalen Wright is out, but we had a good day from Carlton Johnson, Fresno State corner. He had an interception of Spencer Rattler, so I'll talk about him later. And Michael Wiley also with the American team. Usually they try to group teammates together, and that was just not the case this time around. Just because Michael Wiley was a backfill, but we'll get to the American team in a second. I'd say maybe stock down was probably the two Penn State corners. Kalen King also posted one of the highest miles per hour numbers of the day. And I think he's physical, and everyone agrees that he is what he is. But he was getting beat. It was interesting. The national team wrapped up practice with a couple 1v1s just to for like 10 push-ups, which is not abnormal for the Senior Bowl practices. But one of them was Devontae Walker versus Kalen King, and they had to run it twice because Kalen King got called for a penalty the first time, so they ran it back. And arguably Kalen King lost that rep pretty handily there. The defense side of the ball of the national team did have to do push-ups. And then Johnny Dixon as well. I think he was fairly unremarkable. These are two guys that we trust the weight room at Penn State. State College's weight room is well known throughout both the NFL and college communities. I think at the end of the day, I expected more of them. Yes, they're athletic and freaky. I wanted more from them. I did. And then a couple neutral days on the national team there as well. Moving on to the D line, which I will note that the D line includes both interior guys and edge players. So, you know, I think that has a lot to do with what system they're running. Uh, but yeah, let's go through it. I think stock up for sure was someone like Latu, who really showed his technique. He was obviously stumped a few times by someone like Telis Fuaga, who they've played against each other, so there's some familiarity there. But I think he really showed his ability to have counters and such. Um, Someone who maybe is not as high of a stock was Tyler Davis. He's an interior defensive lineman from Clemson. And he looked like he kept losing his footing. He was playing off balance. So, yeah. But anyway, happy to answer a question here. It looks like we're looking for some Leggett opinions. I personally am not someone who looks too much into season long narratives, and so I don't have too much of an opinion on. Generally we see that people who surge in their fifth year aren't. Usually it's a little bit of a fluke, but who knows? I will say Leggett primarily worked in the middle of the field for South Carolina, and that's fine. He's physical. Whether or not he's tall, I think is secondary. And wasn't super important to his game, despite being listed at 6'3", and he measured in just short of 6'1", I believe. And so, I think, and it was interesting, right? Today, we'll get to the American team. I guess I can talk about it now. Leggett looked interesting because, for maybe the first time ever, he was asked to do a lot of, sideline routes with, Spencer Rattler still throwing to him. And, usually that existing teammate chemistry really plays out well. But that one struggled a little bit because it was a very different concept than what Leggett is typically asked to do. And so, yeah, obviously those DK and Alshon Jeffrey comparisons are probably unwarranted, just because he doesn't have that level of physical, dimensions or whatever. And you say you're worried that it's more of a Jonathan Mingo, Brian Edwards, which are good receivers, I believe, that are in bad situations. Obviously, Mingo had his troubles. There was that one clip on Twitter that went around, made its rounds, where it looked like he was trying to get out of bounds. But I think there is a space in the NFL for more physical in cutting route receivers, and Leggett could fill that. I will say I was a little bit stocked down on him today. Yeah, and so moving through here, defensive line, stock down was Tyler Davis. The Michigan guys also, both Braden McGregor and Jalen Harrell, they're both edges. They've looked a little weak. They kept getting washed out, which is okay. They are on the lighter side, but it's one of those things where you would have liked to see a little bit more. Yeah, moving on to linebackers here. I think this linebacking crew is interesting, in that you have someone like Peyton Wilson, who I think has first or second round tape, but he's had 2 knee injuries, 2 shoulder injuries, plus a couple other injuries I think that have been nagging him here and there. And so I if I'm an executive, I don't touch him with a 10-foot pole. I think that's 2 shoulders by itself is bad. 2 knees by itself is bad. 1 knee injury by itself is bad, and yet you have all 4 of those joints under duress. So, yeah, but he looked good. He looked like he knew what he's doing. Yeah, and someone like Cedric Gray was, he struggled a little bit in coverage here or there, but he recovered in run defense. I'll skip over to the QBs just because I see this question here from Justin Massey here. Like, any QBs that stood out, so I can go over both teams here really quickly. And in the morning section, it was not super inspiring. I think Bo Nix was probably a little bit nervous. He was struggling to step into throws, and so I think I hope that we see a much better practice tomorrow from him. Michael Penix was showing, this is a small group, so I'll just go through every single one of them. Michael Penix is showing why he's a perfect fit in that Kalen DeBoer system. but also why he may not be the best fit for an NFL system, right? And so if you look at it, Kalen DeBoer's system is very much predicated on vertical spacing. And you saw that with receivers that didn't necessarily separate well, in someone like Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk. I know that may be a hot take to some of you, but they weren't creating massive yards of separation. A lot of it was stacking corners and taking that vertical spacing from them. And Penix was throwing very much those kind of concepts, despite the coaching staff not asking for that. And so it's interesting where if he's used to these wide receivers that he has chemistry with, Polk, Odunze, Jalen McMillan, who may be one of the more underrated receivers in this draft. Those are completed passes, but we're looking at different concepts. We're looking at receivers that just come from different systems, and it didn't necessarily mesh. And so I'd hope to see him adjust that as well. By comparison, Sam Hartman almost looked good. There was one very good throw to Roman Wilson that, frankly, he could have thrown anywhere and would have caught it because Roman Wilson was just that wide open. Maybe not all credit goes to him on that, but he was wide open. Sam Hartman had a couple decent throws. I think, I think I had a UDFA grade on him coming into this day. I think he might get drafted in round 6 or 7. I think it's possible now. Like, I think at the very least teams will like his intangibles. They always will. And then the other point to that is that he I hesitate to say this, although I don't really hesitate to say this. He looks the part, right? And so, I think that's an interesting point. Moving on to the other side, Spencer Rattler had a decent day, all things considered, until the very last bit of practice where, he threw an interception straight to Carlton Johnson, like I mentioned. All things considered, I think he probably needs a little bit of help in terms of in terms of forgetting some of his past mistakes. Joe Milton was exactly what we expected from Joe Milton. He was not particularly accurate. The saying is whether a quarterback can hit the broadside of a barn. Joe Milton may not hit the broadside of the barn, but he will definitely throw the ball over it, and oftentimes he will try to throw the ball through the barn as well. And some of the receivers were struggling with that level of power as well. But there were some plays on deeper routes where clearly the other quarterbacks were struggling to get that ball down there, and Joe Milton didn't have a problem with it. And it doesn't hurt that he's also like 3 inches taller than the next tallest quarterback probably on this, or maybe at least 2 inches taller. He was by far the tallest quarterback there, which is definitely a plus. Mike was mentioning that he really liked Michael Pratt's day, and I don't disagree. I had a lot of gripes with his mechanics in certain situations, but I think he fixed a lot of those, and he looked professional, calm. Mike was mentioning that he kind of takes this idea to the fullest extent, which is that quarterbacks are supposed to throw the ball where only their receiver can get it. And Pratt does that to an extent where his receivers almost can't catch it, but the defender's definitely not catching it, right? And so I think it was a good day, and I think his stock probably is up from that. And then lastly, Carter Bradley is probably kind of the same boat as Sam Hartman, where he's probably in draftable range now. I think he showed himself fairly well. A lot of the concepts that the American team quarterbacks were throwing were just basic 5-yard outs, and that's okay because the receivers were open there. And we'll talk about it when we get to the receivers. But all things considered, it was it was a good showing from Carter Bradley, all things considered. But I wouldn't say it's the type of performance that vaults him into first or second day consideration. So hope that answers your question. I would say the number one quarterback that probably stood out today was Michael Pratt. And then negatively, either Joe Milton or Bo Nix. But I fully expect Bo Nix to get his feet under him and start stepping into his throws. It really was a basic mechanics thing that we didn't see on tape, which tells me that he was just kind of nervous and short-arming things and not wanting to overthrow, which is fine. It happens. And so if he has good practices the next day or two, I think it'll be just fine. But moving back down to we are at offensive lineman for the national team, and so you know, I you could take this as a stock up or a stock down, but I'd like to talk about Jordan Morgan, who was specifically asked by coaches to take drills a little bit easier because, even when he wasn't the one doing the drill, so he would be someone that like is simulating the defender or something, he would just run too fast into the blocker or aggressively, and the coaches were not really having any part of that. And so I think there's something good to be said there, but also maybe something bad where maybe a slight lack of professionalism, but he was really doing great when he was in the drills as well. I posted a clip on Twitter earlier today where he knocks over, I believe it was maybe Henderson was holding a pad, and he just punches that pad so hard that the Michigan player just falls over on the ground. And granted, he wasn't in the best balance position, but it really had an impact on those watching today. And so it was at the very least amusing, right? I think players like Kingsley Sumataya and Jackson Powers Johnson also had good days. I was surprised with Roger Rosengarten's movement ability, although I will say he does have a crossover in his step every once in a while. Players that saw a little bit more coaching than others, Dominic Pooney, we know what he can do. He was a tackle in college, probably kicking into guard. Not the best day, but that's okay. The more important thing is he is receiving coaching and receiving it well. And so I'll say I think that all things considered, it's a positive, but he has a lot to work on here. And the other one I'd say is Isaiah Adams. He was working with the guards. He's a very tall. I don't know what he measured in at, but at Illinois he was listed, I believe, at 6'7", and so he's probably closer to 6'5" if I had to guess. But that's still big for a guard, right? And so I fully expect him to figure it out. But I think he even had a couple center reps in there. But and he played some. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that he played mostly guard this season, but. That's a guy who has some versatility just by virtue of having played multiple positions, whether it be to injury or to graduation, etc. And so, I think there's some room for improvement there. And Satoa Lomea, he looked a little small. And then lastly, Ethan Driscoll was getting eaten alive a little bit in some of these drills. And so I think there's a clear step up in competition between Marshall and what we're seeing in the Senior Bowl, which, most of these guys get drafted. And so it's something that we can expect, but also, for someone who physically looks imposing out there, I thought he looked slim compared to most offensive linemen, just like very compact build while also being one of the taller people there. So interesting all around for sure. Let's talk some running backs here. There aren't that many of them. We were looking for a couple things here, right? Dylan Lobb was on this team, and he looked every bit the pass catcher that we expected. Was he necessarily the runner? I've heard some folks remark on his second level acceleration. I think that's hard to judge in an area where most people are, it's not full contact. No one's going to the ground. And so, okay. I think, and I didn't see anything super positive out of Rasheen Ali either. He looked very small. He was seeing a lot of media attention in terms of interviews and such. And so for his sake, I hope that, there are some things that come up in interviews that really help him, but I don't know that he put too much on tape in practice that might convince decision makers otherwise. But stock up, I definitely want to talk about Isaiah Davis. I know I had a very high variance of outcomes for him. I in our preview show, I had mentioned that he's probably like somewhere between rounds 4 and 7. So he's going to be drafted on day 3, but I don't know when. Was basically my grade on him. And I think that his hands were much more natural than I expected. For someone who barely caught the ball at South Dakota State, 2-time national champion, had like over 3,000 yards the past 2 seasons, I believe. Crazy numbers. So you expect, okay, some people will knock him down a little bit because he's just an FCS running back. But an FCS running back who has 3,000 yards over 2 seasons is going to, garner some sort of attention. And I like his build the best. At 6'2", 220, that's kind of what you want in an NFL running back in today's game. And so, all things considered, I think he availed himself well, and there were some good things. Tight end for the national team. There were only 3 of them, so I guess I could talk about all of them. It was a Big Ten group here. We had Minnesota, Michigan, and Penn State represented. We actually got to briefly talk with Theo Johnson and Brevin Spann-Ford. And so look forward to that interview being posted somewhere in some format, in some capacity. Not quite sure about that execution yet, but yeah, AJ Barner was struggling offensively in terms of as a pass catcher, I should say. But he was every bit the blocker that he was advertised. All 3 of them were good blockers as advertised. I would say Theo Johnson probably had the best day out of 3. And so probably, alphabetical order or it's not even alphabetical order. I don't know what order this is. But it would probably go Theo Johnson, Brevin Spann-Ford, and AJ Barner for the 3 of them. And finally, for the receivers, talk about up and down day. I know a lot of you are probably curious about Tez Walker, the guy who went from, NC Central to Kent State and then suddenly pops up to UNC, and Daniel Jeremiah's mocking him in the first round. Okay. So what do we see here? He had a couple drops. He had a couple batted balls that, you'd like to see eliminated for someone who's being considered in the first round, for sure. That being said, do I think that he is someone that a team will value? For sure. I think so. I think he had the highest miles per hour time or a speed clocked for the national team this whole day. So that's big, right? Granted, he was running more deep routes, which someone like, Jacob Cowing isn't going to get those speed numbers just because he's not running far enough for it to, register. And so, yeah, I think he's a deep threat. He looked much smaller than advertised. And so I think I heard many people remark on that. But, up and down day, it's hard to say stock up or stock down for him. But I think that's a notable performance where he was the one that was selected to do the 1v1 at the end of practice for push-ups. So, he was the offensive representative. And I think that says a lot, at least about the team. Ricky Pearsall is someone that Mike and I were both very high on coming into the day, and it was kind of a mixed day for him as well, where he was falling a little bit, had some balls that he might have had a chance at, but he dropped, and so I'll say stock down for sure for me was Brendan Rice, and maybe Luke McCaffrey as well, where. Starting with Brendan Rice, right? The pedigree, you expect so much out of that last name, I should say, right? And for someone, I think Brendan Rice is a little bit high cut for a wide receiver. His hips live very high on his body, which is okay. It happens. But it slows down his cuts. And so he's trying to do all these releases and these breaks the same as someone like Ladd McConkey or Jacob Cowing, people who are much shorter than him that are able to lower that center of gravity and maintain some sort of standard there. I'm not sure on whose advice he's doing that, but for sure, I think that he got that advice from someone and he's trying to show off his footwork. And I don't think it's working for him. I think if he markets himself as a deep threat type of guy, he has the speed, he has decent size. I think it'll work. I think he's being asked to be an all-around receiver when that's just not his game. And then finally for one big stock up, I don't know that necessarily he was amazing or necessarily he's vaulting himself multiple rounds, but Roman Wilson had a very good day for someone we just didn't have tape of because Michigan threw 10 passes a game or so. I think Roman Wilson did well for himself. He was wide open on like I mentioned, that pass from Sam Hartman that scored a touchdown. I mean, it was during team practice, so obviously the touchdown didn't mean too much, but he was. I think he was open often enough, and he was making tough catches, and he's athletic, and so I think it's fine. But I'm not willing to gush over right Roman Wilson like NFL Network is. Um, I think it's a little bit short sighted to move stock so much based on performance like that, especially considering all things considered. Hear me out here. Uh, that even when he was wide open, it rarely was because he was creating separation at a stem or taking advantage of a super great crosser. It was just he ran a basic post route that against cover two, which is as the counter to cover two, right? And it was like a basic cover two look. He ran a post against it, and he just wasn't covered and picked up. And so okay, yeah, he was wide open. He deserves credit for being open. He caught the ball and scored. And there were a couple of plays where he caught one deep ball while he was covered. It was impressive, yeah. But do I consider him having jumped more than a round or so? Like, oh no, not really. Maybe half a round. I'll give him that. It looked good today, on a day in which the receivers, at least on the national team, were struggling a little bit due to the physicality of the corners. But yeah, um, and Luke McCaffrey, I just think he's a fish out of water here. I don't know where to put him. He's not a particularly good route runner, and he has decent aerial skills in ball tracking, but he's just not physical enough, so he gets knocked out. And I think nothing's more points to his day than the fact that he got a really bad turf burn that was just bleeding all over everybody on his lower back, and so hopefully that heals up quickly for him. We wish him the best, but I'm not sure what I see in his NFL potential. Moving on to the national American team, I should say. The American team was interesting. My alma mater, Maryland, players were there, as well as Mike's alma mater, Kentucky players were all there, as well as I believe three, maybe four Auburn players, which was wild. There were a couple Missouri super fans there as well. I think there were three or four of them as well, even after Ennis Rexstrup dropped out. So yeah, some mixed reviews first, I should say. Chris Abrams-Drain from Missouri, the converted four-star wide receiver. Uh, he had a mixed day. He was clearly a at least vocal leader for the position group, which you love to see when it comes to practices. Another person that I'll mention later who also did the same thing was Trevin Wallace, right? He was in charge, making calls, whether it's the coaching staff that decided, which is significant as well, or just taking the initiative, which is also a very big positive. I think Chris Abrams-Drain and Trevin Wallace both did well for themselves. I will say my fellow Maryland alum, Bo Braid, probably had a little bit of a rough day. He was struggling to move his feet at the break point, which is something we saw on tape as well. And so if he can just be a little bit more active with his feet, I think it'll go a long way. Nehemiah Pritchett, the corner from Auburn, on the other hand, had a phenomenal day. Almost as good as Quinyon Mitchell, I'd say. Just he was batting balls left and right. He was in coverage constantly. Jalen Simpson also had a good day, the safety from Auburn as well. But Nehemiah Pritchett, he was doing really well for himself today. So I think that's very notable. Moving on to the defensive linemen here, and I believe the defensive linemen are still grouped with the edges on this team, although they on Twitter when they announced it, a lot of them were mixed in with the linebackers as well. But yeah, I'd say that stock up is Braden Fisk, but that's probably too easy of an answer for you, right? Fisk, as we all remember, blew up that Louisville game for Florida State. And I really hope I get a chance to talk to Braden Fisk tomorrow, because I'd love to hear his insights on moving up in competition from Western Michigan to Florida State, because I'd argue his tape got even better during that year. And so is it because he had more talent around him, or is it something that we can discuss about, okay, like, while it was fun having Marshawn Nealand around, when the defense is playing a certain system or against or made to counter specific systems in the ACC, there's Mike. I think that there's a role there as well. And Yeah, and so T'Vondre Sweat also had a pretty good day as well. But those are guys we kind of expected to see have a good game, a good day. Um, yeah, I don't know that I necessarily saw anyone really struggling on the American team for the defensive line. I would say Darius Robinson was getting forklifted every once in a while. Not terribly, you know, not terribly sure what was going on there, but um, you know, yeah, I think that Darius Robinson probably needs to put on a few pounds to play on the interior. He was lining up at like the 3-eye or even 5 tech, and I think he saw some even at like a 1 tech alignment. And I just don't think that's his game yet. He needs to put on some of that rookie peanut butter, if you will. And yeah, that's basically it. At linebacker, I mentioned Trevin Wallace was kind of the radio guy, if you will, getting the calls. Uh, yeah, and then the other person that I do want to mention is that James Williams was clearly the biggest player on the field in terms of relative to position size, and it was quite shocking. It was just easily the biggest guy on the field among the linebackers, um, uh, and he showed the physicality to match. Where there was one play where his zone blocking, so he blocked up again. He made contact with 3 different blockers, freeing up everyone else. And so, I think it was quite interesting in that 6'4" is a little bit bigger than most linebackers we see. Um, Especially in this day and age, but 230 is roughly about where we want a linebacker to be. So okay, someone who can cover because he played a lot of safety at Miami, and so I hope to see a lot more of him throughout the week as well. Um, Offensive linemen, we had an interesting conversation with Andrew Rain, the center from Oklahoma. There were a lot of people that were playing center because the American team had more quarterbacks. One of those people is Christian Haynes, who played guard throughout his entire career at UConn, never played in college, and suddenly is asked to snap when it comes to Senior Bowl. And I think he did okay. I wouldn't say he was outstanding, but it was good and good enough. Charles Turner III was also another center there. Stock up for me was definitely Christian Jones. I mentioned Christian Jones at some point, I think, on one of the preview shows. The offensive tackle from Texas. And and Christian Jones, I think, is interesting. Dane mentioned how he has good recovery. I thought what was most interesting about him actually was the fact that the way he moves his feet, even forward, is a much smoother process than he was working with Jeremy Flax on the closest to the bleachers, and Jeremy Flax was clearly probably stronger than Christian Jones. But Jones just moves smoother, whether it's like when he's driving forward, his feet kick up less, or the fact that like he understands how to block with the outside of his arm and shoulder and shield defenders, or so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think Christian Jones probably has a higher ceiling. I don't know what kind of role he plays at the next level necessarily, but I think the skill is definitely there. Javon Foster also had a decent day, the tackle from Missouri. Yeah, and probably, yeah, we'll leave it at that. I already covered the quarterbacks for this team, so let's move on to the running backs. We mentioned Cody Schrader at some point, I think on the preview show, Truman State stand-up, as Felix might say. um, and yeah, Cody Schrader, high energy, high effort guy. He was constantly getting beat up by the defenders a little bit, just because they all wanted a shot at him. He did well for himself, but I wouldn't say his stock necessarily moved too much. Ray Davis obviously had a great day. In talking with a bunch of people there, one of the things we all agreed on was if whatever Ray Davis is going to run in Indianapolis on the 40, we wish it was 0.07 seconds faster. We just want it like a little bit faster, and I think he would be a much higher rated prospect. But as it stands right now, I think we're in a space where he just might be a tad too slow to be a high end running back. And then, I think stock down might be someone like Imani Bailey, who, while exciting with the ball in his hands, doesn't have the contact balance to really make it long term in the league. And but all that being said, he probably has a role on an NFL team somewhere, and so I wouldn't, in terms of fantasy value, I wouldn't give him up completely. But in terms of pure football value, I don't know that he has any sort of, even Pro Bowl level aspirations necessarily. But yeah, before we move on to receivers and tight ends, like Felix mentioned, like the video, subscribe to us if you support what we do, whether it's increasing awareness on college football or just simply forwarding the view of evaluation is important, even in fantasy football. And so we really do appreciate it. And, your support allows people like me and Mike to come down here and to evaluate players in person and to be able to have these conversations with them. And so we appreciate your support, and make sure to like the video and subscribe and tune in for other shows. But we're not quite done yet. I know that sounded like we were wrapping up, but we have 2 more position groups to go through real quickly, covering all 3 of the tight ends for the American team really quickly. Ben Sinnott looked much better than I expected. We mentioned on our preview show that he struggles to turn, and I still think that's mostly true, but he looked very agile, more agile than I think I was used to seeing him. So I think that's a positive as well. Jaheim Bell had a rough day. Obviously he's the athletic tight end of the group. He's only at 6'2", so he's on the very small side. He's supposed to be an athletic freak that plays multiple alignments and just does some crazy things. And I just think that, I think he had the keys to the drops. He was a little bit nervous. He wasn't running at full speed when he needed to, and then running full speed when he shouldn't have. So yeah, I hope to see some improvement from Jaheim Bell, especially because while I think he's a willing blocker, I think he was exposed a little bit in some of the blocking and stuff. Jared Wiley had a phenomenal catch on the sideline that really had the entire crowd really chattering about it. At the end of the day, I think Jared Wiley is a receiving only tight end. I really don't know about his blocking ability, but big bodied guy that moves better than I expected. Partially because I think his lower half isn't quite as heavy as some of the other tight ends. I think he's built much more top heavy, which might lead you to believe that he might be knocked over easier. But I think he has some decent run ability as well. And so I think there is a fantasy future for Jared Wiley, maybe even more than someone like Jaheim Bell, and possibly even more than Ben Sinnott, even though I believe Ben Sinnott will definitely be drafted higher than the other 2. And touched on Xavier Legette earlier, but I'll go over it again. He's a physical guy, but he's not quite as big as advertised. He needs to go inside, and I think it was a stock down day for him. I think clearly we were hoping that he would still be that dominant physical force despite being shorter than advertised, and he just wasn't that. Other receivers, Ryan Flournoy caught possibly every single pass that hit his hands on the one-on-one drills. And I think that's really quite impressive for someone who, I think maybe a week ago wasn't even signed up to participate in this event. I think we nailed him though. Physical guy. He's not necessarily a route runner, but he's a tough, strong hands type of guy, and that's exactly what he did. Or most of his catches were just slants, basic slants. 5-yard ends. But that's all he needs to do because that is his role. And he is as big as advertised at 6'2", and so just short of 200, I believe. And so really impressed. Keep an eye out throughout the process for SEMO wide receiver Ryan Flournoy. Quick notes here, going down the list because all of these guys have something notable to say here. Jamari Thrash looks much smaller than we thought, but had a pretty decent day. Had a couple deep catches, but then can also get knocked off his route. So it was kind of a mixed day, but I think that all things considered positive because, I mentioned in the previous show, he's kind of the guy that can dish it but can't take it. And so I think he took it a little bit today, and while it wasn't always positive, I think it showed that he had enough play strength, despite the fact that I even thought he looked smaller than on tape today in practice. So I don't know. We'll see. Jaquan Jackson, he has that chemistry, wide receiver from Tulane. He has that chemistry with Michael Pratt. And I think every time that he came up on 1v1, I think Pratt kind of skipped the line to make sure he was throwing Jaquan Jackson. They had that connection. He didn't catch every ball necessarily, but I think there was a little bit of connection there. Someone who surprised, I think, amongst the two Georgia wide receivers, actually Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, where it seemed like the quarterbacks really liked him. Whether it was the coaching staff that was telling them to throw to Rosemy-Jacksaint, which is also a positive, or it was just the quarterbacks liking that he was open or whatever. I mean, granted, he ran a lot of like 5-yard outs and 5-yard ins and slants and such, which are, quarterback friendly routes. If you want to really, really debate that, then we can later at a different time. But he received that level of targets. And so I was noteworthy at the very least for someone that I consider to be a UDFA coming into this. And then finally, or not finally, we'll talk about Ladd McConkey. I hope Felix is still around for this. Yeah, absolutely. Ladd McConkey really made some money today. I dreaded seeing Ladd McConkey perform really well, but early underdog best ball drafts. Yeah, I mean, yes. And the reason for Ladd McConkey's rise here, right, is not necessarily that he's so football good, right? Because almost all of his catches were within 10 yards. I think he could get open if given more time, but that's not his game at the end of the day, right? I like to say that in today's NFL, the receivers that win are the ones that either separate at ease. So those are your like, whether it's with route running or speed, right? Speed would obviously be someone like Tyreek Hill. Not that he's not a good route runner. He's also a very good route runner. Or someone like Keenan Allen, which is the opposite extreme, where he ran something like a 4.640, right? But he's such a good route runner that he creates separation, both horizontal and vertical, right? Horizontal being the example in college of Josh Heupel's offense, creates horizontal spacing, versus Kalen DeBoer's offense, which creates vertical spacing. And so, I think both of those are necessary at the next level, which, Tennessee and Washington wide receivers are old Fresno State receivers as well. They at least have one of those dimensions, which allows them to contribute fairly soon, which is why someone like Jalen Moreno-Cropper was getting a whole bunch of buzz last year in Cowboys training camp. But Ladd McConkey is someone that creates separation with ease and is tough enough to catch it, right? Where no one's feet are moving as fast as Ladd McConkey's on these routes. And it's not that he's necessarily creating on separation, but he has enough nuance in his routes that he is an available target at almost any given play just because of the way that he runs his routes. And so I might be becoming a fan and getting on board the Ladd McConkey train. I hope there's enough space for me there, Felix. Finally, the last two we're talking about here. Johnny Wilson. Is Johnny Wilson a top wide receiver in this class? I would say that's a pretty easy no from me. I'll say this. His size clearly played. His reach clearly played. He had some decent, catch radius catches that people shorter than him wouldn't have gotten to, and that's okay. That's part of his game, and that is going to be the strength of his game. On the other hand, is Johnny Wilson going to create separation? Absolutely not. The only way he's getting catches is if he stops in the middle of the field, turns around to catch the ball, and the corner is just smaller than him, which in many cases he was a full head taller than the guys that were covering him. So I did hear pre-Senior Bowl that he was going to be working out with the tight ends. He wasn't really. Not that the American team was really splitting between wide receivers and tight ends. Even in 1v1s, they were going up against corners and safeties alike. Cam Kinchins, I think, for example, went up against Was it Led McConkey? It's one of those situations where it didn't really matter whether he was a wide receiver or tight end in today's particular practice, but I don't know that he can switch to tight end just because he doesn't move well enough to be a move tight end, and he also doesn't block well enough to be a traditional tight end. I think his single role is to be a jump ball receiver. And I don't know how valuable that is. If you think back to the old Texas roster where Lil Jordan Humphrey and I believe Colin Johnson came out maybe in the same year and weren't that good, even though both of them were like, something like 6'5" or something. It's some ridiculously ludicrous height. I think there is a role for Wilson, but it will be an end of the roster, like Hail Mary type of guy, which will get him on a roster, I believe, or at least a practice squad. But I don't know that he has the potential to be a Pro Bowl or an All Pro. I just don't see it. And for someone who doesn't have that movement skill, I don't know that we can necessarily peg him down for that. And then Anaya Smith was someone who we wanted more out of. There was one play where there was a tipped ball that ended up in an interception, and the ball just bounced off of Anaya Smith's hands. This is a guy who switched from wide receiver to running back to wide receiver at Texas A&M. Had a couple of character red flags in terms of run-ins with the law. He looked athletic today for sure. He was fast and explosive, but he struggled a little bit with the hands. His route running wasn't super clean. I'd expect him to go undrafted if for no other reason than his troubles with the law. But I don't know that he necessarily dispelled any doubts on him today. Hopefully he can, shore up his hands, show a little bit more hip flexibility on his route running. That's a problem. That's a big problem with the guys who switch from running back to wide receiver. I didn't mention Malachi Corley, but that's someone that maybe had a negative day today in that he was really trying his best to prove how good of a receiver he was, not just a playmaker, right? And I don't know how successful he was in that. And so in a similar vein, I think Anaya Smith struggled as well. Is Antonio Brown an appropriate comp for Ladd McConkey? I struggle to compare incoming rookies with people who are all pros at one point in their lives or the best at their position in the entire NFL. I think Ladd McConkey is clearly an NFL difference maker. I think that he is one of the plus route runners within 10 yards that there is in this draft, maybe even top 10 in the NFL, possibly when he gets there. But, which isn't a dig on anyone else. And I'm not hyping him up as a top 10 receiver overall. I'm talking about if you remember back to the old day, the prime Cole Beasley days, which were not many, but there was a few prime Cole Beasley days where if you needed 5 yards, you were getting 5 yards with Cole Beasley. He was running a 5-yard out. Everyone knew what route he was running, but he was open on that 5-yard out, and it was a first down. And I think Ladd McConkey's 80th percentile outcome is probably that role in of Cole Beasley, maybe even 90%. Because I will always err on the side of conservative when it comes to comparing rookies to people who played in the NFL. Because, we talk to all these prospects about the process or the upbringing they had coming from high school football to college football and then college football to even to the Senior Bowl and beyond. And I think every single player we talked to today mentioned the biggest thing, even between college football and the Senior Bowl, is that as you progress in the ranks of football through time and, education, what have you, the biggest difference is level of competition, right? And and that level of competition, someone like Ladd McConkey has seen the highest level of competition that college football has to offer. But, a lot of these guys were saying, like, even the talent level of the Senior Bowl is just so different than anything they faced in college, whether it was in practice, especially for some of the Georgia guys, or whether it was, in games against other teams, we just didn't. These players are mentioning like they haven't seen this level of talent before, and when you come to an all-star game, that's what this is for. And so, to wrap up really quickly here, which I'm wrapping up, but if you have any last minute questions, get them in now so I can maybe address them, or at least keep an eye out for them next time. But as I wrap up here, I think we have to remember what the purpose of all-star games is, right? We're not here to necessarily overturn people's draft stocks, whether it's up or down. We're here to confirm, as erroneous, as fallacious as it sounds. We're here to confirm our priors that we developed from watching tape. It should confirm tape, or it should have us go back to the tape and figure out what we missed. But it isn't here to overturn the tape. Same thing with the combine, right? You see it 40 times that you don't agree with. Prime example is someone like Kyle Hamilton, right? Where he ran a 4.740 and we expected to see a slow player on tape. But for all of us who had watched his tape, we know that a throw could be made from the middle of the field and Kyle Hamilton can react from the opposite hash and make an interception on the opposite sideline. So I think at the end of the day, a lot of our priors were at least put to the test. But, I think there's an opportunity for people to really make a difference here. And so, yes, everyone is asking this question: who is this year's Puka Nacua? Which, I will fully admit Mike was on that train way before I even really had fully watched his tape. And so, the short answer is I don't know, right? Like, if you remember, Puka Nacua actually disappeared after the first day of practice last year. He just kind of withdrew. They said he had an injury. If you've ever watched The Internship, the movie with Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson, they have that really stuck-up guy that says, like, time to fake an injury. Well, did Puka Nacua fake an injury? It's possible. I think it's possible. That's my outlandish claim for you, Felix. He probably faked an injury in the last year. I think for me, the names to watch out for, Devontae Walker is already getting the hype, so it can't be him. I'm gonna go out there and say, while we didn't see anything from Javon Baker, and while we didn't see anything from Ricky Pearsall today, those are my two candidates for guys that can just really shoot up draft boards, where the tape really is more impressive than you'd imagine, right? Javon Baker, that narrative side is really what's holding him back, right? Where, transferring down from P5 to G5 into a UCF system where he was considered in a competition for wide receiver 1 at the beginning of the season, if we all remember, way before he was this CFF darling that we all came to know through the 2023 season. And so I love his physical run style of Javon Baker. I love and mind you, we all talk about Tez Walker as a deep threat. In almost double the volume, I believe, Javon Baker had a higher ADOT, average depth of target, than Tez Walker. So, and that's not to say he wasn't capable of running, comebacks and other things. Is he going to create separation necessarily on the break? Probably not. I mean, he will create some, but not to the level of someone like, Tank Dell or someone that we talked about last year. We're talking about a guy that will use angles and cushion management to really get downfield, and then use that threat of downfield threat to create openings for himself underneath. And so that's one guy. And the other guy is obviously Ricky Pearsall, which I've compared him, this is my outlandish claim here. I believe Ricky Pearsall could be a faster Jason Avant, 80% of Jason Avant, right? I think he's the type of guy that you look for when you need a first down. Not maybe as automatic as Cole Beasley, but Jason Avant was a great route runner who had good hands, but he ran a 4.740 for a wide receiver. But he was getting first down after first down for the Eagles for years and years and years in the mid-aughts. And so, I think that Ricky Pearsall, while he had a rough day today for sure, And I think he's just adjusting to the level of physicality because slot receivers aren't always granted the benefit of being in the slot at the Senior Bowl. That's not how 101s work, right? And so if he can show more slot snaps, I think he can really show his acumen in terms of, a catch radius that is surprising in that you would expect slot receivers to just, catch the ball that hits them in the hands. But Pearsall really dives down for it, jumps up for it. He had those aerial skills and those, diving skills as well. So I was impressed with his tape. I want him to show it here so that people can get on board with the same thing that, I saw on tape. But, Thielen was a little bit different as well. I think Thielen worked a little bit more of the sideline than Ricky Pearsall does. And Thielen was also a good route runner in that he was very good at stacking. He created vertical space very well, which paired well with, what they were doing on the Vikings for all that time. But I think for more of a middle of the field guy in Pearsall, I like his potential to make an impact early as well. And then, the outlandish claim can also be that Ladd McConkey's route running is probably the best here at the Senior Bowl. I don't think that's really too debatable. And so I guess the outlandish claim is that he could also be the Puka Nacua that goes for, maybe not the rookie record, but he could threaten 1,000 yards, maybe even his rookie season, depending on his landing spot. If he goes to a, check down dependent, 5 short yardage to try to create yak type of system, then I think that's very possible. But yes, you are correct that, the adjustments that college players have to make in college to their personnel is often the type of system that makes them most fit in the NFL. I was talking with Mike earlier about this, right? Those who create their own models, which that's a misnomer. Those aren't real models. Talk to me about their stochastic processes in order to call it a model. But okay, so for people who rely on their models, they're claiming. Some people claim that, especially us at C2C, we focus too much on, systems and such, instead of just looking for good players. Which, fair. The evaluation of good players is the cornerstone of our process in terms of deciding who's a good fantasy asset, who's a good football player. That's integral, right? But the assumption that relying on scheme is too strong and that talent matters more is also a tenuous proposition, because you are relying on this idea that players are assigned randomly to teams. And so that if a player doesn't match the scheme, then they won't. The assumption is, 1, if the player doesn't match the scheme, they won't produce. And 2, the assumption is that players that don't produce don't fit the scheme, which is probably incorrect, because there's a baseline level of the system fits, because recruiting is not random. Players are not assigned to teams randomly. And so that's my little soapbox stand for today. But yeah, that's a good point. Like Ricky Pearsall had to adjust to, Anthony Richardson and Graham Mertz throwing the ball to him, which was by no means accurate. But, Anthony Richardson also landed in a spot in Indianapolis where they have guys like Mo Alley Cox and the UVA tight end, Jelani Woods, right? These 6'7" behemoths. And then while he's a free agent now, who knows whether he will return to the Colts. Michael Pittman was also something like 6'3" or something. They had tall receivers. Alec Pierce is, I think, also like 6'3" or something, 6'2", 6'3". Those are tall receivers that have big catch radiuses, so they can adjust to these, adjust to the poor throws that Anthony Richardson had. And so, yeah, to wrap things up really quickly, I would like to see more out of the receiver corps, because it seemed like the focus today was at least on the running backs, and the running backs did well for themselves. But I look forward to all the progress in terms of building confidence and just more progression in terms of just comfortability with the coaching staff, etc. I look forward to that in terms of this setting, such that their evaluations can get, we wish the best for every player that we come across. And so, yeah, with that, like again, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be here. Mike and I will be here all week. And so follow us on Twitter. You can find me at PKJBLee, and you can find Mike at FF_Dirty Mike. Yeah, we have some posts. We'll post some practice clips, and we'll be doing these recap shows every night. So, and then you can also expect an article or two from us after this. So, with that, good night, and make sure to tweet us or Discord us or what have you, your questions or players you want us to watch out for, and we'll report back to you. So, with that, good night, and thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.